And welcome back to Session 9, your lecture. This is Part 1. Diving right in, we've got our session aims as we usually start, to explore the third of the earliest documented whole medical systems that are still in practice today, to contextualize the development of Chinese medicine within a changing political and global landscape, which is a very important part of Chinese medicine, and to define the key concepts and philosophies within the system of Chinese medicine. So this kind of doesn't sound like much, but it actually is quite a bit. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, and the lecture this time will be in 4 parts because of this being quite a large system to cover. So please make sure that you watch all 4 parts. So here again we have a whole medical system that's based on a framework of the 5 elements in nature and the place of man within a larger cosmology. So this is common to reflecting back on our last lecture on Ayurveda. And man as being part of nature and part of the universe. So this is a repetitive theme in the history of traditional medicine as well as the whole medical systems. And again, this is a system similar to Ayurveda that is tied tightly to a really complex philosophical framework, as well as being concerned with the state of the mind, the emotions, and the spirit, along with the body. So it's a very holistic system. So Chinese medicine has had a very long and ultimately very successful history of development and use in China and abroad. It's very widely used around the world now, more so than any of our other traditional medical systems. Its core principles were initially based on the laws of nature and are applied from both a vitalistic and a physio-medical perspective. So this is similar to Ayurveda in that it's a very infinitely complex system of concepts, and we can't really do true justice to it in a single lecture session. So this is a very broad overview of the system, and just being aware of that, that we can't go into too much depth given that we have a single lecture to cover this. It takes many, many years of study and practice to properly understand this system as it does with Ayurveda. And many of the ways of thinking within this system also are not what we consider familiar to the Western mind in terms of the types of logic that we tend to use or that we're accustomed to. So that can also be said of early European medicine, which we're going to tackle in a couple of weeks. And so again, approach this with an open mind and see if you can find any nuggets here for yourself that will really help tie you into this thought process and the philosophical framework. The Eastern philosophy is based on the premise that all of life occurs within the cycle of nature, and the human being is seen as the microcosm of nature or a smaller universe. And so this is really a beautiful concept. We'll just have a little bit of comparison between Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, since we just did Ayurveda in our last lecture, and because there are some similarities between these systems. Original Ayurvedic texts are about 500 to 1,000 years older than original Chinese medicine texts. There's no evidence of significant migration of information to imply that Chinese medicine grew out of Ayurveda, though, so that's important to note. And the age of the texts doesn't necessarily provide us accurate information about the age of the system of medicine, because certainly there were things going on in these traditions that were happening before systems of writing were in existence. And so it comes down to who got around to writing it down first in some instances. Also, we have to acknowledge that there may have been earlier texts in both systems that had been destroyed over time because they weren't durable to the elements. So the theory underlying traditional acupuncture may date as far back as 4,000 to 5,000 years from the present. And the earliest type acupuncture needles, and I say needles because they weren't made of metal the way we think of needles now, they date back to the Stone Age, and they were made of stone or sometimes of bone fragment. So here's a picture of some of those needles in this picture, are tools that are shaped similar to what the ancient acupuncture needles were shaped like. So you can see they were not very thin. They had to stand up to being able to be driven in without breaking, and not having metal, that's a tricky thing. So both Chinese medicine and Ayurveda probably come from some common root back in the Eurasian Stone Age, of Stone Age healing that included ethnobotany and shamanic practices and an elemental conception of matter. But we don't know that for a fact. This is just a supposition. Some similarities within the elemental bases of these medicines is that they're both based on 5 elements, but the 5 elements are different. Also, in the concept of prana, we have a reflection in Chinese medicine of the concept of qi. They are the similar but not the same. And in their methods of pharmacy, they base their treatments on humoral theories and the laws of contraries. So that is similar between the two. And that's contrasting to the law of similars, which we'll see in homeopathy on down the track this semester. And then I mentioned in the last session the marma points and the nadis, which are energy channels in Vedic thought, have some similarity in concept to the Chinese medicine acupuncture points and meridians. So you can see that there are some parallels there. Ayurveda will really connect tightly in with mythology of gods and goddesses from Hinduism, and Chinese medicine doesn't have this component. Chinese medicine is an established medicine that's quite distinct from religion early on in its history, although it has a connection to Taoist and Confucian philosophies that are still there, and that some people might consider Taoism or Confucianism somewhat like religions, and some people might consider them philosophies. But there isn't the presence of the gods and goddesses that you have in Hinduism and in other traditional medicines. The systems of these two medicines and their sort of philosophical frameworks is really where the similarities end, because the treatments are quite different. The way they move energy, for example, Chinese medicine moves energy via direct stimulation with needles on the meridians and points. That doesn't have any comparison in Ayurveda particularly. And likewise, the comprehensive system of yoga doesn't really have any comparator in Chinese medicine, although the discipline of Qigong in Chinese medicine has some similarities in that they both yoga and Qigong have the goal of cultivating the life force or the vitality. There is no parallel for the Ayurvedic doshas in Chinese medicine, and as with Tibetan medicine, Chinese medicine often discusses the energetics of food and herbs exactly opposite to how Ayurveda discusses them. So that's another contrast. Reconciling these systems is quite impossible. I'll tell you a story. My first year in naturopathic university, I had 3 roommates. 2 of them were studying Chinese medicine, and 1 of them was studying Ayurveda. And I got to sit and listen to them at the dinner table arguing about, are eggs hot or are eggs cold, in terms of the energetics of the food, for example. It was a constant barrage of lack of consistency between the two systems. So I think that they are probably impossible to reconcile, and one has to choose their art and their approach likewise. So the beautiful thing about both of them is that they both have this very comprehensive internal logic and philosophy, and it really weaves together beautifully in order to create these really distinct, really complex systems of medicine that have lasted, both of them, through thousands of years. And essentially each one can be considered a separate science entirely to itself, despite the fact that there are some similarities in the conceptual framework. So we'll just take a really broad overview of the history of China. Most of you are probably familiar with the fact that China's history is based upon its dynasties and the periods of time that certain dynasties were in power. So you see this here in the timeline here, just an overview of some of the major dynasties, and you can refer back to this slide as you're studying, because throughout this lecture we'll refer to certain things taking place in the development of Chinese medicine during a certain dynasty or during a certain period. It's also important to recognize when China came out of this dynastic period. And so you can see the dynasties ended in the early 1900s. That isn't that long ago, really. It's only 100 years ago. And China became a republic. And then it became the People's Republic of China at mid-century in last century. So it is one of the oldest civilizations in continuous existence on the planet, and it has a widely variable and quite a lot of upheaval in its history. As to the history of Chinese medicine, the earliest medical texts, the Ma Wang Dui, the date is uncertain on this one, but likely sometime between 1500 and 200 BCE. This text identified 11 of the 12 major acupuncture channels, but it didn't identify the specific points on those channels, and the points are where the treatments actually take place. It also listed medical theories related to the physiology associated with a certain channel. So the 12 channels are associated with 12 organs in the body, and this text listed medical theories that went along with the physiology of those organs. What would happen if an organ was replete, which means that it has all that it needs? What would happen if it was in a state of vacuity, which means deficiency or emptiness? And what would happen if there was undesirable movement of energy with that organ? So an example of that would be rebellious stomach qi, when the stomach qi is moving upward instead of moving downward. There was no identification of needling within this text. However, moxa, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that is later, and beyond stone practice were likely modalities of treatment at this point in time. So the earliest modes of Chinese healing before formalized Chinese medicine were shamanic in nature, and they relied on supernatural guidance or altered states of consciousness. And this is not present in formalized Chinese medicine. So whereas when we were talking about Tibetan medicine in the last lecture, the Tibetan medicine incorporated its pre-Buddhist shamanistic roots along with the other traditions that it incorporated from Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and Greco-Arabic medicine into its total system of Tibetan medicine. Chinese medicine didn't do that. It didn't keep its shamanistic roots, and so we don't see that in Chinese medicine. The image here on this slide is a manuscript that is written on silk from an archaeological evacuation from around the time of this earliest medical text. And so we see from this early text that the template of Chinese medicine is about 3,000 years old. The Bian stone that's mentioned here as being a form of treatment at that time, it's an implement used to perform something called gua sha. And gua sha is a type of treatment that involves the scraping of the skin. It's a treatment that is still used today, but it no longer uses a stone. And we'll talk more about gua sha later on in this lecture. So in the Han Dynasty, which was 206 BCE to about 220 of the Common Era, this was the golden age of Chinese medicine development. And there were many key classical texts written during that time. Some of them are still in use today, and the major ones still in use today are the Huangdi Neijing, the Nanjing, and the Shanghunlun. And the key medical texts also perform the basis of other traditional medical practice. That were subsequently established in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. So we see these key texts having migrated to other countries in the East and also to other places in the world in more recent times. So the Qin dynasty was prior to the Han, and there were developments in Chinese herbal medicine during that time. There was a classical Materia Medica text that expanded on an earlier herbal text from the Warring States period. And the earlier text contained 365 herbal medicines and their associated medicinal uses. So that's quite a nice, well-rounded Materia Medica. It also included anesthetics in the form of herbal formulas that arose during that period for performance of surgeries. So this is quite a sophisticated level of medicine for that period of time in the Qin dynasty. The image here on this slide is a page from the Huangdi Neijing Su Wen. And the Su Wen is the portion of that book that forms the mainstay of Chinese medicine theory today. That is part of the text that covers the whole basic framework of Chinese medicine. And we'll talk more about that text shortly. Acupuncture was developed really significantly during this period, during the Han Dynasty, noted on this slide. And certainly the concept of beyond stone at that point in time, or the gua sha I was just talking about, had been replaced by a form of acupuncture needle by that time. During the Han Dynasty, the needles were made out of gold and silver, and they were significantly longer than the ones used today, which implies that they went in deeper. They were also needles called sword needles, and those were used by acupuncturists to conduct minor surgeries like draining abscesses. Minor surgery was the domain of the acupuncturist as a Chinese doctor during that time. So back to this mainstay text, the Yellow Emperor's canon, internal canon, which is the Huangdi Neijing. It was written between 206 BCE and 50 of the Common Era, and it has detailed use of key acupuncture points in management of specific diseases. So this is a prescriptive text that really sets out how you treat certain diseases. With the 12 regular meridians, those are the 12 major meridians of the 12 organs, and 295 acupuncture points are identified in this text. It also presented 12 herbal medicine formulae, as well as procedures for bloodletting and moxibustion. So I just want to talk for a minute about bloodletting, because this term means something, or was used somehow quite differently than we would see bloodletting used in European medicine later on. Bloodletting in Chinese medicine can amount to drawing a single drop of blood out of an acupuncture point, or a few drops of blood out of an acupuncture point, whereas in later European medicine, we'll see bloodletting used to actually open a blood vessel and drain a significant amount of blood out of a person. So they're used quite differently, and that's important to know. So there are two major components of the Huangdi Neijing. The Su Wen, which I mentioned on the last slide, which is called the Fundamental Questions, and it is a collection of medical questions and considerations. And then the Ling Shu, which is the spiritual axis, and it lays out the theories of yin and yang, the 5 phase theories. And when I say 5 phases, that's a synonymous term for the 5 elements. It identified 11 organs, and the internal and external causes of disease were defined. So this book is still used today as a classical Chinese medical text, and it is as important to Chinese medicine as the works of Hippocrates are, called the Hippocratic Corpus, which we'll see when we study Greco-Roman medicine. So it's important to Chinese medicine as the Hippocratic Corpus is to Western medicine. Like the Hippocratic Corpus, which we'll hear about next week, the Yellow Emperor's internal canon was likely constructed from the collective thoughts of a number of different key Chinese medicine professionals around this time. It probably was not a single author that wrote it, and we can tell this from the differing writing styles that take place throughout it. And the collective authors aren't acknowledged, but there are some contrasting and conflicting views within it, and so it's another way that we know that it might be a compilation of different authors. The Huangdi Neijing is attributed to a famous doctor who served the Yellow Emperor, whose name is Qibo, and he was the author of a number of other medical treatises as well. And he's given credit for passing ancient and divine information on medicine down to his followers. So he was sort of the hub of communication of a lot of different sources of historical and perhaps divine information. So the Yellow Emperor, referenced in the book here, the book title as well as within the book itself, took the throne about 2698 BCE. So you can see that was significantly prior to when this book was actually written. And this text really laid down the underlying framework for Chinese medicine practice. It also discussed the importance of good health, diet and living, the effects of seasonal change and the elements on health, and how health declines with age. And so we have here again this parallel to Ayurveda that's similar. It also covered the etiology of disease, the pathology and diagnostics, therapeutics, and all preventative measures, as well as ethics of medicine, psychology, and cosmology. So this is a very comprehensive text. It developed over centuries. And the definitive version of it is dated to the 1st century BCE, and that's still considered to be the authoritative guide now. A number of other texts followed this one, and we won't talk about all of those texts because it would be beyond the scope of a single lecture. But each of the following texts really further developed an area of Chinese medicine diagnosis and treatment, including acupuncture and herbal medicine and other therapies, to bring the medicine to full development in the modern age. Some examples of these additional texts. In the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, there was the Classic of Difficult Issues, which outlined a comprehensive system of therapeutic needling, the most comprehensive book on needling, acupuncture needling to date at that point. And 259 of the Common Era, the names and functions of the acupuncture points were textualized in the Classic of Acupuncture, which was another text. So historically in Chinese society, there was evidence of a shift from a matrilineal to a patrilineal culture in the 4th to the 3rd millennium BCE. So this is significantly before the Common Era, back in the Stone Age and, it would have been the Bronze Age at that point in time, from the 4th to the 3rd millennium BCE. And we see this similarity across a number of different places in the world as we travel through this semester, where the more traditional pre-civilization cultures had somewhat of a matriarchal society, or one that had more balance between the masculine and feminine, and then we see this shift into the more patriarchal society. So this is common to Chinese history as well. The society is bonded by strong ties of obligation at all levels to the family, to community and king, and to worship of the ancestors. And so there's a lot of honor given to the ancestors, as well as one's existing family and the elders in one's existing family. There are numerous subgroups of people and cultures, as well as different languages spoken in different parts of China. And we see the tie to nature that generally originates in these ancient societies during the matriarchal or more balanced stage of their existence, usually is where the ties of the culture to nature's laws come from. And oftentimes that is lost as the shift happens to patriarchy. So we see that certainly in European culture happening. But in Chinese culture, that didn't happen. So the ties to nature and nature cycles and the 5 elements were maintained with this shift into a patriarchal and more hierarchical type of society. So the image on this slide is of oracle bones. This is a divination tool that's from the period prior to 1000 BCE in Chinese culture, and you can see the pictographs on there. Historical Chinese society ran on a feudal state system that prevailed in the period before Chinese medicine developed. So this was the early dynasties. There was a period of monarchy and urbanization and assimilation of scattered nomadic people that followed the warring states period. And remind you that you've got that slide that you can refer back to that has the timeline of all the different periods that we'll refer to through this lecture. And then Confucianism and Taoism also developed during this period as well. And we'll talk more about Taoism later on because that's tied quite closely to Chinese medicine, less of a focus on Confucianism in the lecture today. So during the feudal system early on, most of the populace were farmers, and they were working the land of their feudal lord. And so we see this also in Western societies, and we'll see that a little later this semester. But many became free landholders when the feudal system collapsed, and so they became free standing farmers of their own land. And in the period following the Warring States period, that's when we saw the major texts of Chinese medicine being developed and completed, and the system of medicine becoming more organized and systematic. So it's possible that the phenomenon of urbanization or assimilation of different cultures is what caused the Chinese medicine theory to begin forming up more solidly at that time, because certainly urbanization would bring more people together, of more scholarly people into a smaller space together and be able to discuss ideas. The development of a monarchy also, because of the patronage of the wealth of the monarchy to things like education, can also relate to that kind of development. So the image here is a wine jar that is from the feudal period, and that's the early period that I'm talking about at the beginning of this slide. Taoism is a philosophy that's very closely connected to the ancient shamanistic traditions and has a lot of imagery from ancient mystics. And its central text is the Tao Te Ching. Notice the pronunciation there, despite the fact that it is spelled in this spelling T-A-O-T-E. And you will see it spelled D-A-O-D-E as well. So just be aware that you'll see those different spellings in different places. So the Tao Te Ching was the central text to Taoism. It was written by a man named Lao Tzu in about the 3rd century BCE. So this is, again, way back. And the Tao is translated roughly as meaning the way, which means the path or road that a person might follow. But the true Tao isn't really definable in that way. And if you study Taoism at all, that's one of the central principles there. So whilst both Confucianism and Taoism were developing in parallel, Taoism is the philosophy that's most closely associated with Chinese medicine, and that's the reason why we have a bit more focus on that in this lecture. Some, again, will consider Taoism a religion. Some of them consider it a mystical tradition, a spirituality, or a philosophy. So it just depends on how it's interacted with. The Tao itself is really undefinable because by its nature, it has no perceptible qualities. And so it is something that is considered imperceptible or indiscernible. So we can think about this as being sort of the energy that pervades the universe, that sort of sets up the framework of the universe's natural laws, is the way that some people might conceptualize that if you're trying to put a more concrete definition on it. But it really is considered to be something that's completely imperceptible, and so it's hard to talk about. And then nothing about it can really be predicated, but it latently contains forms, entities, and forces of all the particular phenomena that manifest from it. So it's essentially the indefinable thing or the indescribable thing that governs the universe. And the aim of a Taoist is to remove all obstacles within themselves to allow them to flow unimpeded in the flow of the Tao. And there are a number of what we might consider New Age philosophies or spiritualities that really comport with this idea that there is this flow in the universe, and if you get in alignment with the flow, or you learn to flow with it instead of fighting against it, that's where the really big power in life comes from to completely manifest the things that you want to manifest. The most important Taoist concepts that are related to Chinese medicine are, first, the continuity between nature and human beings, so everything is seen as being part of the greater whole, and the rhythm of constant flux and transformation in the universe, which means that all things are returning to and leaving at the same time the Tao from which they emerged. So it's an interesting concept to play with, and I encourage you to look more into it if you're interested in that. So in the Taoist cosmology, which is a more magical or alchemical type of cosmology rather than being materialistic or animistic, there's a plane flying over. Excuse the ambient sound. So it looks at life as a microcosm, macrocosm philosophy, with the universe viewed hierarchically organized, in which each subpart mirrors the whole. So the human mirrors the larger universe, the tree mirrors the larger universe. And the central tenets of this cosmology are the tenets of yin and yang, and of the 5 phases, or the 5 elements. So within Taoist cosmology, we see this very close relationship between humans and the universe. And the human is the microcosm. It replicates the entire world. And there's an integral unity of mankind and the natural order. So again, we are a part of nature, not apart from nature, as we see in a lot of the traditional philosophies and medicines. The philosophy of Chinese medicine is a Taoist one, and it states that contemplation and reflection on sensory perception of the world and nature is sufficient to understand the human condition, including illness and health. So it's the observation of the nature of things is what informs what we do within our medicine. The image here is of the 8 trigrams of the I Ching. And the I Ching is an ancient system and text of divination. It predates Taoism, but it's been woven into Taoist practice and philosophy. And we'll talk more about that yin and yang symbol that's in the middle of that hexagram there, the 8 trigrams. And we'll talk about the yin and yang on the next slide. So yin and yang, I'm sure, is something that you have heard about just in casual conversation. People use it now to talk about all sorts of things. Sometimes it's quite misused or misunderstood. And so if you've not ever been quite clear on exactly what yin and yang are about, this is your opportunity to establish that for yourself. So yin and yang theory states that everything in the universe is composed of a combination of yin and yang. So yin and yang are essentially the 2 halves of a dual universe. And they are in opposition to each other. So yin opposes yang, yang opposes yin, and they are completely interdependent. So one cannot exist without the other. Each is said to consume and be transformed into the other. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So the existence and interactions of polarity in nature and in humans is the basis of yin and yang theory. So in the easiest way to conceptualize this, we can say, okay, we experience a lot of opposites in our life on a daily basis. There's hot and cold. There's light and dark. There's wet and dry. So we can list these exhaustively on and on all day long. And that is the basis of observation, that there are these, that the universe is combined, made up of these things that are in opposition, that rely on each other for existence. And that is part of the cosmology of Taoism and central to Chinese medicine. So the world and all of life is made up of these paired opposites, each of which is complementary to and gives meaning to the other one. So we wouldn't be able to define light if we weren't aware of dark. And we wouldn't be able to define dry if we didn't know what wet was. So by virtue of there being opposites, it gives us the comparator by which we can create a description. This is a manifestation of essentially a single cosmic force that has 2 poles of existence, and each is the cause of the other, and they're continually transforming into each other. They can't exist one without the other, and they're always relative one to the other. So nothing is ever entirely yin, and nothing is ever entirely yang. So I'm just going to jump to this slide. I'm going to jump back to that other one in just a second. So this slide just gives you some common examples of the polarities of qualities in nature and in people that represent yin and yang aspects. So yin is represented by the earth, yang is represented by heaven. Yin is the moon, yang is the sun. Yin is dark, yang is light. Yin is wet, yang is dry. Yin is cold, yang is hot. Yin is stillness and yang is movement, particularly forward movement. Yin is considered nourishing, yang is protecting. Yin is receptive, yang is creative, and by creative, we're not talking about art necessarily, but creative in like a seed sprouting into a plant, for example, in nature. Yin is night, yang is day, as that makes sense with the sun and the moon as above. Yin is an internal quality, yang is an external one. And lastly, I want to spend a little bit more time. Yin is feminine and yang is masculine. So you see this, this idea of dark and light, yin and yang. And sometimes folks will talk about yin and yang, and we'll talk about yin as being dark and yang as being light, and they place a value judgment on that, like bad and good. And I want to make it clear that that is not the case here. That is not the meaning of yin and yang. And so when you hear people talk like that, you can give them a little lesson in yin and yang. There is no bad or good here. All of the universe has to have these two sides to it in order for things to stay in balance and for things to stay healthy. We can't have an endless day with no night. We can't have endless dry with no wet. Life would not be sustained in that instance. And I like to particularly draw attention to the fact that the feminine and masculine, as they are related to all of these pairings of different qualities, you can think about the feminine in terms of the archetypal feminine energy as being related to all of these things on the left side of the chart, and archetypally masculine on the right side of the chart. But again, as with the doshas and Ayurveda, it's very important to recognize that everything is made up of a mix of these two things. And so with people, you can have females that have even a stronger influence of masculine qualities than they do feminine qualities. And likewise, you can have men who have a stronger leaning towards feminine qualities than masculine qualities. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody has their own mixture of these things. And even the most feminine woman does have some masculine qualities, and likewise with men. So it's really important to understand that when we talk about feminine and masculine, it is not something that is there's no strong boundary between those two things. Everything is a blend, and there's no value judgment in any of it. They both are considered vital to existence. So I'm just going to go back to this prior slide for a minute and take this back up. So you can see on the symbol that there's this polarity of light and dark in the symbol. And the black side of the symbol is the yin side. The white side of it is the yang side, in the contrast of light and dark, yang and yin. But you see that each one has a seed of the other. So there's never a pure yang or a pure yin state. Each state always has some of the other in it. And the shape of the symbol showing as one grows, the other one is shrinking, and as the other one grows, then the other one is shrinking. So they feed into each other, and they create a balance. So that's the reason for the symbology there, the reason for the design of that symbol. So jumping on the philosophy of healing in Chinese medicine. So yin and yang must be equal and in harmony in order to create health. And achieving balance is the core underpinning the principle of health. And you see this as being true in all of the elemental-based systems of medicine. But Chinese medicine has this added impetus to balance yin and yang, the balance of the masculine and feminine, if you want to look at it that way, or the balance of light and dark, or dry and wet, all things that are associated with yin and yang. The further out of balance you become, either in yin or in yang, the greater risk that you have of developing a disease. And Chinese medicine treatment will focus on balancing the properties of yin and yang. So ultimately, the treatment principles are aimed at this balance of yin and yang. And in different interventions in Chinese medicine, there's also some discussion of actually balancing the elements too. And we'll talk more about the elements later in this lecture. Illnesses in Chinese medicine are described in terms of yin or yang, excess or deficiency, or sometimes stagnation. So a disease can be a manifestation of yin deficiency, and that would mean that one symptom might be that the patient feels hot and dry, or looking at it otherwise, there would be a deficiency of coolness and moisture. So think about that. Yin is cool and moist, in its properties from the last slide. And if you had a deficiency of yin, then you might tend to feel hot and dry. However, you can also have an excess of yang, and yang's principles are hot and dry, and if you have an excess of that, you might also feel hot and dry. And so you can't necessarily discern which is going on, or they can both be going on at the same time, and you have to use other diagnostic factors to know what's going on. Overall, whether the patient's in a state of deficiency or a state of excess. Likewise, on the flip side, you could have a condition that's a manifestation of a yang deficiency, and if you had a yang deficiency, so you were deficient in hot and dryness, you might feel cold and fatigued or heavy, for example, and feel not like moving. Whereas a yin excess, you might also feel cold, you might retain water and have too much moisture, as an example of a yin excess. So there's some foundational history and concepts for Chinese medicine. This is the end of part 1 of this lecture, and you've got your revision questions there. Our other food for thought: what are the similarities and differences between the concept of yin and yang in Chinese medicine and the concept of the free doshas in Ayurveda? So I'll leave you to ponder that, compare and contrast, and hope that you have fun with that. And we'll see you in part 2 of this lecture. Thanks for joining.